Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerers Guild. Today we are going to be discussing the skills of Spellcraft, the first essay in the Sorcerer's Shadow Volume 1 Edition 2. The first video in this list describes the book and the chapters therein. This will be the first video covering the essays. There is an introduction before that, but I prefer to leave you with the introduction to sorcery. I will leave the video to that there, and there will be several laws of sorcery that I am discussing in here. I have some other videos that I will link you to when we get to those if you want to listen to more in depth on the particular laws. Then you can watch those videos after this one. Okay, so skills of Spellcraft. The first thing I say here is to become sorcerers, we must learn to overcome the superstition that magic does not exist. In the modern age, we're taught not to believe in magic, to resist the idea. When we feel those little intuitions in our mind, we are taught to ignore these things. We must overcome that superstition. Modern science, in fact, is beginning to prove that magic is real. For a long time, we've had proof of the law of perceptions, belief imparts reality. This is shown to us in the placebo effect. They tell us that faith healing isn't real, but at the same time, when they study a new medication, they give some people the correct medication, and they give some people a sugar pill called a placebo. They have to do this because they have to account for the placebo effect. And that is the amount of people that will get better simply because they have been told they are getting better. This is the power of faith in action. There are times even when simply the theater of surgery will cause a person to begin feeling better. And this is simply because they believe. But it goes beyond this. They have also recently isolated a chemical in the brain called DMT. This is the chemical that is released from the brain when you have a spiritual experience. When I talk about achieving gnosis, essentially what we're trying to do is convince our brain to release a little bit of that DMT. Now, I cover both of those in the book. Another one that I don't cover here that I want to bring up is the quantum entanglement. That is the idea that we are all linked together and entangled in a giant quantum field. And once two items are linked, or two molecules, once two things are linked, what you do to one affects the other. This is once again science beginning to come across the laws of sorcery. This is how we create a link. This is why a lock of hair from a person can affect them, because they are linked. They are quantumly entangled. And what you do to one affects the other. So, the idea that magic does not exist is indeed a superstition, and one that you need to get over, so that your mind does not tell you that things aren't magical when they are. Doesn't push away the intuition, doesn't push away that feeling, doesn't block that little drop of DMT that you want to release when you're achieving gnosis. Okay, so from there I go on about ritual, meditation, and prayer, and then I get into the idea that magic is individual. That DMT that I just talked about. What convinces my brain to release that DMT is different than yours. So I can't just say, alright, now draw this exact symbol, move in this exact way, say these exact words, and you will cast a spell. It's not going to work. You need to believe it. It needs to touch you. Magic is a form of self-expression. You need to reach into yourself. You need to understand magic on a personal level. You need to come to terms with it within you. Now, there are things that I can teach you, such as the the 4 aspects of the mechanics of sorcery that we are going to get into in just a moment, but you need to create your own art over top of that framework in order for the spell to work. And that's why here I keep talking about the idea that magic is individual. Okay, so the 4 mechanical aspects of a spell. The first is intent, and it's actually quite simple. Intent is what you want to happen. Here you want to get down to exactly what you want. You want, even if that idea is vague, then you write it down vague, but this is where you get your idea. And you want to be sure of what you want, and you want to actually want it so that you feel it, so that it pulls you, so that you feel it, and it is expression in that intent. From the intent, we then go on to form. At one point, I was discussing a law of containment along with form. I will link the video to that here. We won't go into the law of containment because it's actually more well defined simply as in the aspect of form. This is the shape of your spell. This is the symbol that you choose. And like I said, I go into quite a bit of detail on that here. We'll go on from there. The third is the charge. This is where that DMT comes in. And it is where we get Gnosis, and I will be discussing this more in the next essay. But for now, what that is getting some of your energy, some of your own life force into the spell so that it has power. This is the battery aspect. The intent is, well, you decide what it is you want. The form is you create it. And then the charge, that's putting the batteries in. Without a charge, without energy, the spell has no way to act. And then after that, there is either containment or release. So either you hold on to the spell, as in a jar spell, and that will come up a little more in the law of repetition that we talk about in a little while. And that is things where, like with your candle magic, where you light the candle and you repeat your form of intent every day. Those are spells that are intent, form, charge, containment. And then we have your intent, form, charge, release. This is like your sigils, symbols that you draw and then immediately destroy so that that energy can go out and perform its spell work. Okay, so after that, we have the 4 laws. Now, before we get into the 4 laws, I do realize there's one part that I wanted to talk about in here that we hadn't gotten to. After I talk about, let's see, where are we? Okay, about how exactly it is that a spell affects the world. Okay, so there is many myriad possibilities around every situation. All the possibilities of what could happen. And these change from moment to moment simply by the energy in a room, the way things are affected. A good way to explain this is, say you've got a coin. Now, the first time that you flip that coin, it's a 50-50 chance whether it's going to be heads or tails. And according to the law of probability in mathematics, every time you flip that coin, the odds are going to be 50-50 as to whether or not that coin is going to be heads or tails. But we all know the odds if you flip in heads 5 times in a row, well, it's not very likely, is it? And the more times you flip heads, the more the probability of you flipping heads again actually goes down, despite the fact that every time you flip that coin, the odds are actually 50-50 whether it will land heads or tails. That decrease in probability, that can't technically be accounted for in science of flipping the coin in each particular flip, that's lines of probability. That's the lines we're messing with. We want to affect the odds. We do this by creating lines of energy that affect the probability within a situation. And we do that by choosing an intent, giving it a form that can affect those odds of probability, lines of probability, and then we charge that form and either contain it so that it creates a field affecting those probabilities, or we release it so that it can go out and affect the probabilities somewhere else. Okay, so now that I have covered that, back to the 4 laws of spellcraft. Okay, and the first one is the law of perceptions. Belief imparts reality. I cover this extensively, over and over again in the book, because it is extremely important. Belief imparts reality. If you don't believe that you can cast a spell, then your energy won't respond. Well, it will respond. It will respond to that disbelief, and it won't believe that you were putting energy into the sigil as you were drawing it, and it won't get its charge. You won't believe in the form, possibly even, and the form simply won't form. It won't become a shape. So, belief imparts reality. Now, before we go on with that, I want to point out that it is imparts reality, not creates reality. There is a base reality that is different from your perceptions. And what you believe to be truth in your perceptions does not necessarily translate to truth in another person's perceptions. For example, the belief of the monotheist that we are all going to burn in hell for practicing witchcraft is not going to place us all in hell. That's an example. Okay, so beyond the law of perceptions, the next law is the law of repetition, and this one matters most in spells that are contained, because you are going to be repeating the intent and strengthening the charge every day. The law of repetition states that for every time a concept is repeated, every time a concept is repeated, the power of its faith increases. And I have a video on momentum and probability that is relevant. I will link that here. You can look over that. The law of repetition, basically what this is that every time that a symbol is used in the same manner, it begins to develop a momentum behind it to be used in that manner. That's why we would like to use ancient symbols. And that's also why we couldn't use, say, the symbol of Aries to create peace. Unless we found a way to reverse the polarity or something like that. We couldn't just throw a symbol of Aries somewhere and expect it to suddenly be used as a peace symbol. It has a lot of momentum behind it, a lot of repetition, a lot of idea of it being involved with war. Simply seeing that symbol, people think of Aries, the god of war. So, repetition. Next is the law of aesthetics. And I cover this one to some extent, of course. What we're looking at here is things need to have a flow to them. When you cast a spell, again, you don't want to use the wrong symbols. You don't want to use that peace symbol. You don't want to use that Aries symbol for peace because it has the wrong aesthetic. People think of it as war. You want to use the proper aesthetic for the spell you're casting. If you are casting a spell that is of a Caribbean descent, and you're casting, a voodoo type spell, you don't want to try and use Kabbalah. You want to stay within the aesthetic and style of the method that you were using. You can mix them up if you can make it aesthetically flow, but you don't want jarring aesthetics. This is also why ritual is important. This is why we wear hooded robes and light candles. This is why showmanship can be a factor, even if you're the only one watching. You want to have things flow nicely. Okay, after the law of aesthetics, we talk about, well, I get into a little bit of the law of irony. And the law of irony is I didn't actually state what the law of aesthetics was. Hold on, let's go back. Sorry. The law of aesthetics is living is an art form that takes place between life and death. And that means that everything flows within a certain style. Things have a tendency to want to keep an aesthetic in them. Okay, so after that, like I said, the law of irony. The law of irony states that in any given situation, the most ironic answer has a larger percentage of accuracy than is statistically possible. What that's really saying is ironic things tend to happen, and this proves that whatever this is, whatever the base of existence is, it does seem to have some sense of humor. Now, in later books, I will cover how to use humor as a magical device. But I don't actually get into that in this book. We will be covering that in later editions. And finally, we have the law of paradox. This law is, well, it's complex. It's the law of paradox. Really, you can be taken as Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. But on the level of spellcraft, this is for every thought, there is an equal and opposite thought. If you choose to believe in such thing as karma, this is the driving force behind it. But what we take away from this is that everything that occurs is going to have a reaction. This is especially important to take into consideration when you are trying to affect an existing spell. When you put new magic into it, it's going to react. It's not going to just, unless you're really good at flowing into the aesthetic style of the existing spell, there's going to be a reaction when you put the new spell in. Anytime you cast a spell, there's going to be a reaction. Not just in what you do, but in the things around it. And this can be very random, but we need to take it into consideration. And that's why the law of paradox, it can sometimes be used to charge spells, but that's not really why it's brought up here. The law of paradox is brought up here to remind you that you need to think about what your spells are going to do. Now, that's not a big deal in that when you create the form, you can actually find ways to stipulate things that you don't want to occur. This is a background in the intent. You want to be thinking about those things you don't want as you create the form. Okay, so that will be it for this episode. Next episode will be creating a charge with an energy vortex. And that will be mostly a guided meditation, but we will discuss the how to produce energy within the body and pump it out through the hands and why it works, as well as link to some previous videos I have already done on that. Okay, so that will be it for this episode. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until then, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.